Hello, and welcome to the discussion series of Buddha Nights. I am Munira Hashimi, playwright, actor, and director. In 2005, I co-founded MPhil Association of Culture and Art in Herat, west of Afghanistan. March 11, 2013, I co-founded A Night with Buddha Festival to commemorate the destruction of world cultural heritage, the Buddha statues of Bamyan. The destruction of Buddhist statues in 2001, which carried out in the continuation of decades of ethnic cleansing with the aim of destroying the history of Hazara people, was beyond massacre. It was a cultural genocide. 21 years later after destruction, even the remains, the empty niche of Buddhist statues, are again in danger in Bamyan. This year, we at Teater, with collaboration of Safe Haven Freedom Talks, arranged a series of discussion to understand the different aspects of destruction of cultural heritage, destroying history, forced forgetting, social discrimination, and genocide against Hazara people. Our guests for this discussion are Anis Rezaei and Sitarah Mohammadi. Anis Rezaei is an MPhil candidate at the University of Oxford. She holds a BA in philosophy, politics, and economics from the University of Essex. Anis has been closely working with Hazara community-based organization in the UK to help facilitate the integration of Hazara into UK society. A contributor to Guardian Australia and writes on Hazaras, Afghanistan, and refugee issues. She completed her dissertation on Australia's refugee policy at University of Oxford. She has a BA in International Relations and Human Rights and is currently undertaking her Juris Doctorate at Monash University Law School in Melbourne, Australia. Sitarah is a legal researcher with the Afghan Human Rights Democracy Organization. The discussion will be moderated by Asad Buda. Asad Buda is a freelance writer. He studied sociology and Islamic theology and has been working as a researcher and university lecturer in Kabul. He is the former Icon guest writer in Karlstad. Det återvändande ögat, a chapter of his personal memoir, was published in Varmland Writers Anthology. He has worked with Riksteater and Teater on a project called Little History, resulted in publishing a book under the title of Hoppets Territorium. Southern Stars and Homo Saker och Fåglarna på Linjegatan are his last published text in the Ord och Bild and Gavet Brewster Art Gallery. He is also involved in visual art, focusing on the demonization of political enemies and aesthetic aspect of extremist and religious violence. We take 1 minute silence for the last shocking attacks on Hazara people in Afghanistan. Indeed, in these attacks, over 300 innocent people were injured and 250 were killed. 126 of those who were killed were school children. Thank you. Thank you, dear Anis and Sitarah, for being with us. Now I leave the platform for Asad and our honest guest to start the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Munira. Thank you, Safe Haven and Freedom Talks and Teater. Thank you very much, Sitarah and Anis. Welcome to this program. In Afghanistan, we are going to talk today about intersectionality matter, problematizing the mainstream discourse on gender analysis in Afghanistan context. So it's because in Afghanistan, we have different narratives of women, the very well-known narrative in Afghanistan is religious narrative of women. So in this narrative, the women are the symbol of shame and guilt, the embodied religious belief. And the other narrative is the kinship or the ethnical narrative of women. So in this narrative, women reduced as a kind of collective embodied of tribe and ethnicity as enormous or something. And in a very short time, we had Soviet Union woman narrative in Afghanistan. So they talked about women as worker. So then the Mujahideen came. And Taliban came after the collapsing of Taliban, the international community came in Afghanistan. We had a lot of activities about gender equality and women issues in Afghanistan. But at the same time, we see that this kind of narrative also had a lot of problem. So the main problem maybe in this context was, so they didn't focus on the context of women experience in Afghanistan or gender discrimination in Afghanistan. The women issues become a kind of gender industry in Afghanistan. So for those who work with women issues and gender discrimination, finding money and selling the women suffering was more important than working for women, or maybe than social equality. So maybe one of the main reasons why that's happened is because many of them didn't have enough knowledge about the context of gender discrimination in Afghanistan. So today we have two guests to talk about that. I want to start with Anis Rezaei. So my question of Anis is, Anis, please, could you tell us more about the mainstream discourses for gender in Afghanistan context, and why is it problematic?
Thank you, Asad. Thank you, everyone, for organizing this talk. Thank you. Special thanks to Safe Haven Freedom Talks. I think in order to answer that question, it would be important for us to ask why mainstream discourse is important. So the reason as to why mainstream discourse or public discourse regarding an issue is important is because public discourse structures the way we think, the way we talk, and the way we reflect on an issue. In the case of Afghanistan, the mainstream discourse on gender has shaped our understanding of women's struggles and challenges in Afghanistan context. And it has in turn shaped our advocacy and activism to transform those social injustices that women in Afghanistan face. And that advocacy in turn has somehow influenced politics and policy initiatives regarding the injustices or social injustices that women in Afghanistan face. Now, the problem with the mainstream discourse is that it has limited our understanding of gender injustice, or it has limited our understanding of the experience of women in Afghanistan. Why I'm saying this is because the mainstream discourse on gender in Afghanistan has oversimplified the experience of women in Afghanistan, in the sense that it has rendered the complexity of women's experience in Afghanistan unimportant. Afghanistan is an incredibly diverse country. There are many ethnic, religious, and cultural groups who coexist within that political space. And given the history of power imbalance and power dynamics between these different groups, one can clearly state that the experience of women in Afghanistan is entirely different. The way women experience social injustice in Afghanistan is different across different groups. The mainstream discourse has not only oversimplified that experience, it has also presented a homogeneous and a singularized it has homogenized and singularized women in Afghanistan, and also the disadvantages that women in Afghanistan face. It has been constantly talking about the gender-related issues that women face at the cost of completely excluding the experience of women in Afghanistan from an ethnic and from a religious kind of point of view. As I said, Afghanistan is an incredibly diverse country, and that diversity calls in for a nuanced approach to understand the different ways that women in Afghanistan experience social injustices. And given that the conversation is going to be mainly focused on the experience of Hazara women, the Hazara women, for example, or women, we can say women from the Sikh community, their experience in Afghanistan is not premised on their gender identity. Their experience is premised on their ethnic, religious, as well as gender identity. Their discrimination, they face discrimination simultaneously based on their gender, on their ethnicity, and on their religion. And the mainstream discourse has failed to incorporate this aspect into the conversation and also into our understanding. So this is called a kind of a multi-level discrimination that requires a different approach, a different tool or a different analytical framework that can help us understand that. And that is why we took it upon ourselves to talk about intersectionality and how intersectionality as a framework can help us understand all these nuances and these complexities. Intersectionality is an analytical framework that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in the US, and Kimberly is a scholar, a writer, and a civil rights advocate. And she coined the intersectionality as a concept in order to highlight the distinct experience of African Americans and women from minority backgrounds in the United States, whose experience was shaped by the intersection of their ethnic, religious, as well as gender identity. And in this, in the context of our today's conversation, we are going to apply intersectionality on the experience of Hazara women. And for us, in order to be able to do that, I think it would be important to understand who are the Hazaras and how the experience of Hazara women in Afghanistan is distinct and different, and how intersectionality can help us understand that better.
So you mean, so they reduced multiple factor to one factor in Afghanistan? So the approach was very maybe one-dimensional. So we need a multi-dimensional approach to the gender discrimination in Afghanistan, especially on focusing of Hazara people, Hazara women as the negative side of Afghan history, as excluded part of Afghan history and situated in forbidden side. So I want to continue the historical background of discussion with Sitarah. And Sitarah, could you elaborate on the history of Hazara, and that what are some distinct challenge experienced by Hazara women in Afghanistan?
Thank you for your question, and thank you for the organizers to bring this platform together for us to be able to have this very important conversation. I would like to begin, as we do here in Australia, by acknowledging the land from which I journey today, the Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I would also wish to pay my respects and extend my condolences to the victims and the families of the targeted attacks of the past few days across Afghanistan. In particular, the young Hazara students whose lives were taken so tragically during the deadly attacks on their school in Dashti-Barchi, west of Kabul. It is important that I begin by stating that the Hazara people are not a homogeneous group, that we have Shia Hazaras, Sunni Hazaras, Ismaili Hazaras, as well as atheist Hazaras. Together, the Hazara population make up roughly more than 30% of the total population of Afghanistan. Ongoing victims of discrimination and violence, the Hazaras remain amongst the most persecuted groups and make up one of the largest groups of refugees around the world. The Hazaras are historically the most discriminated ethnic group in Afghanistan and saw little improvement in their situation despite the presence of foreign forces over the last 20 years in the country. Sanctioned state persecution, discrimination, and exclusion against the Hazaras began in the late 19th century. In bringing the region's many different elements under a centralized authority, the Pashtun ruler at the time, Amir Abdurrahman Khan, identified the Hazaras as a threat to ethnic Pashtun dominance and therefore incited religious and ethnic hatred to conquer them in a series of exceptionally brutal wars. Abdurrahman did this by instigating a jihad against the Hazaras, who were perceived in his eyes as infidels due to Hazaras' links to Shia sect of Islam in a predominantly Sunni Muslim state of Afghanistan. Some 62 to 63% of the Hazara population was eliminated by Abdurrahman, either killed, sold into slavery, or forced into exile. To depopulate the Hazarajat region, the Abdurrahman government issued royal decrees authorizing Pashtun nomads, known as Kochis, to access and take over Hazaras' lands and their livestock by force. In particular, Hazara women were used as slaves by dominant groups in the country. Flowing from this, Hazaras are still being attacked and killed. Their homes are burnt or taken away by Pashtun Kochis today. Kochis still claim annual land rights based on the decrees issued by Abdurrahman in the late 19th century. Then victorious Abdurrahman claimed that Afghans saw Hazaras as, quote, enemies of their country and religion, unquote, laying the foundation of the Hazaras' ongoing persecution, exclusion, and discrimination by dominant groups today. Significantly, this established a pattern in which successive governments marginalized the Hazaras for much of the 19th and 20th centuries, and during the monarchy from the 1929 onwards, when during the process of Pashtunization, Hazaras were made to conceal their identities in order to obtain state identification cards.
So you mean this kind of historical background influenced the Hazara people,
Yes.
and especially Hazara women. So if we want to, for example, talk about the gender discrimination, to cover all women in Afghanistan, so we need other framework. So the mainstream discourses doesn't tell anything. So this is, do you mean because of this unique experience of Hazara people as excluded in Afghan history, we need a kind of new perspective or intersectional approach, Sitarah?
Absolutely. And if I may just cover a few points in terms of historical context. So in his books, The Hazaras of Afghanistan, Sayyid Asghar Masavi says that until the 1970s, the killings of the Hazara people were declared by Sunni Pashtun clerics as an accepted and sanctified means of gaining God's favor and securing oneself in a place of heaven. The suppression, discrimination, and persecution against the Hazaras endured in the late 1990s under then the rule of the Taliban. Based on ethnic and religious identity during the 1990s, the Taliban starved thousands of Hazaras to death by blocking food access to them. The Taliban's massacre of thousands of Hazaras in Mazar-e-Sharif in 1998 remains one of the most notorious atrocities in the 40-year conflict in the country. During the massacre, between 8,000 to 15,000 Hazaras are estimated to have been killed in just 3 days, an event that became the trigger for major refugee flows into Western countries. During the massacres, the Taliban presented 3 options for the Hazara people: to become Sunni Muslims, to leave Afghanistan, or to risk being killed. This massacre has been described genocidal in its ferocity by author Ahmad Rashid. So while violence is widespread across Afghanistan and the suffering of all people is collective, Hazaras have been subjected to a chain of systemic and targeted attacks for persecution, murder, and genocide based on 3 main factors: Hazara identity as an ethnic group, religious identity, as Hazaras are predominantly Shia Muslims in a Sunni majority state, and more recently, Hazaras have been targeted based on hard-earned success in education, in sports, in politics, and for progressive and democratic values. Hazaras are mentioned to be the beating heart of Afghanistan and the main ethnic group that can challenge and threaten the religious conservative views, extremism, nepotism, and ethnic favoritism, which has ingrained both the Afghan society and the government throughout history. Hazara children and youth, particularly young girls, are routinely attacked, mostly because Hazaras as a population are the driving force of social change, freedom, and the progression of society, as well as the emancipation of girls and women in the country. So the Hazara people are perceived as ethnically, religiously, physically, and linguistically distinct in Afghanistan. The plight of Hazaras is rooted in a history of slavery and oppression that dates back way before the current conflict and violence in the country. Hazara women in particular continue to remain the most vulnerable, subjugated and subjected to discrimination and persecution based on their ethnic, gender, and religious identity.
So it was a very good historical background and why we need to see from other angle or other perspective to the women. So the women who are a generation and generation more than 1 century, they are target killing of the political structure, and they are target killing of many different form of maybe government. So to understand themselves, maybe we need other framework. So I want to ask Anis more about that. So as you mentioned before, so intersectionality is a kind of framework which provide us to analyze the gender discrimination in Afghanistan. And can you explain a little more about that?
Yeah, sure, thank you. As Sitarah John pointed out, Hazara people are experiencing or have been experiencing oppression, injustice, discrimination based on their ethnicity, their religion, and the fact that they are far more progressive ethnic group in Afghanistan in comparison to other ethnic groups. But when it comes to Hazara women, there is another element to this. There is another factor that shape a distinct experience for Hazara women, and that is gender. So in the sense that Hazara women's experience in Afghanistan is shaped by the intersection of their gender. Hazara women's experience is shaped by the intersection of their ethnic, religious, as well as their gender identity. So it is the intersection of all these identities that shape a distinct and a unique experience for Hazara women. So this is called a kind of a multiple subordinating identities. Hazara women, in the sense, are not only subordinated because of their gender identity. Hazara women are subordinated because of their religious identity, because of their ethnic identity, and because of the fact that they lead a liberal, progressive lives in comparison to women from other groups in Afghanistan. So that these all factors has intersected and shaped a different experience for them. And as I said at the very beginning about the mainstream discourse, I said that mainstream discourse has limited our understanding of gender issues in Afghanistan. It has limited our understanding of women's experience in Afghanistan. And in order to be able to address that limited understanding, and in order to be able to understand the complexity of women's experience in Afghanistan, we need a new perspective. We need a new framework, and that is intersectionality. Intersectionality can help us understand the complex ways in which gender, religion, and ethnic identities interact and intersect with one another and shape a distinct and unique experience for women from the ethnically oppressed groups such as the Hazaras. So
you mean, for example, Hazara people as a diverse community. So because Hazara people are Shia, Ismaili, and Sunni. So if even there is a Sunni Hazara woman, so she is under discrimination, different discrimination because of her identity and physical structure. If they are, so they are not same with the other women. So if they are, for example, Hazara, Shia people, so they also discriminate by different factors. For if they are Ismaili, so they are a minority, so maybe they experience multi the factor discrimination. So you mean that the intersectionality perspective help us to understand this kind of factor better?
Exactly, yeah, that's exactly what I'm trying to say. And also with respect to given that, as Sitarah also highlighted, that Hazaras are not a homogeneous group. Hazaras are a internally very diverse group. With respect to the experience of Sunni women from the Sunni, Hazara women from the Sunni religion, they experience a distinct kind of injustice within the Hazara community. But whereas when it comes to the experience of Shia Hazaras, they experience a distinct kind of injustice within the broader system. So it's very complex. And what I'm trying to state is that intersectionality can help us see that complexity. It can help us understand that complexity, and it can help us formulate policies that can transform those specific injustices that target certain groups within the society. And as previously we talked about intersectionality, intersectionality is all about a matter of justice. How can we use how can an intersectional approach help us bring justice to these women from multiple subordinating identities? So this is about justice. Once we understand that women in Afghanistan experience distinct social injustices, distinct inequalities that are premised on their ethnicity, on their religion, as well as on their gender, that is when we can effectively and meaningfully address this issue. And in addition to that, I think it would be important for us to also highlight that when it comes to gender issues, gender analysis, it is incredibly important for us to acknowledge that we cannot understand gender issues as an isolated kind of system of power or power structure. It is part and parcel of the system of power that has shaped a society as a whole. And that intersectionality can help us understand that. And it can help us see how the power structure within a society that subordinates certain groups of people can have a disproportionate impact on women from that subordinated group because of their gender as well as their ethnic and religious identities. So that is why intersectionality is incredibly important.
Yeah, so I think that is a very important perspective because if we just talk about gender discrimination, very abstract and not distinguish the factor, and it would be maybe a lot of problem, and so maybe not understandable to see what's going in Afghanistan, as Sitarah mentioned before that. So there is a lot of issues, historical issues, and a part of conflict, political conflict, is about how to behave with women. So we experienced, as Sitarah told, we experienced historically that what happened to Hazara women. So the Lilios Hamilton book was her daughter, and there is many report about that in Siraj al-Tawarikh, and also Kandahar diary, how Hazara people discriminate, or how, for example, Amir Abdul Rahman army burn a Hazara woman in the evening during the 80, 92, and 93 in Ruzgan, and when they burned the woman, so they danced around her burned body. So it's maybe because of that unique experience. For example, Pashtun women, they are really experience gender discrimination, but not ethnic discrimination, not religious discrimination. Because of this, we need this new approach, you mean. Can you talk a little experimentally, and then we will ask Sitarah? So how, for example, how you see the difference, for example, in the practice between a Hazara woman and other? For example, there is a lot of women, they are supporting Taliban, advocating for Taliban in the Western countries. So do you mean, is it because it's because of different experience, or maybe what's the reason?
So, yeah, thank you for that. Again, this takes us back on how the mainstream discourse is shaped. So as I said, women from the dominant ethnic groups are mainly the ones who represent women from Afghanistan. They represent the experience of women from Afghanistan. And they normally, because of the fact that they are part of the system of power, they are they kind of benefit from that system of power. They are less likely to understand the distinct experience of women who are excluded from that power, and that can be Hazara women. And with the women who are again, this is an issue of ethnicity, women who support the Taliban, for example. It's because of the fact that there are certain benefits that they can draw from supporting the Taliban, and the fact that they in Afghanistan, it is not only the issue of gender that needs focus. It is actually the issue of the fact that when it comes to women's rights, the fact that women experience injustices, oppression, discrimination on a multi-dimensional level, particularly women from historically subordinated and subjugated groups such as the Hazaras. And the other factor with the mainstream discourse, and I think it's important to highlight, is that it is the portrayal of Afghanistan as a patriarchal society. when we talk in every context, when we introduce ourselves that we are from Afghanistan, the first thing that people come and when it comes to gender issues, of course, they come and ask is whether women are allowed to study, whether women are allowed to get an education. And given that the mainstream discourse always talks about patriarchy, women's lack of access to education, men's domination of over women, that kind of that obscures the contribution of Hazara men to the development of Hazara women, the contribution of Hazara men within the society, within the community, that can facilitate the Hazara women's access to education, access to resources, and access to power within that community, within that small system that they have. So that's also kind of a homogenized representation or portrayal of Afghanistan within the international community. And intersectionality can help us understand and address that effectively.
Yeah, so that's a good point. Sitarah also mentioned, so one of reason for discrimination against the Hazara at the last decades is because they are really interested in democratic values, and they are really interested in new perspective to the Afghanistan based of human rights, and they are really, there is a very political will in Hazara society for a democratic Afghanistan, developed Afghanistan. So do you think, Sitarah, is it also because of uniqueness of Hazara people experience, or for example, Hazara women, so they are really interested to go to school. So the head of Human Rights Commission, so she was Hazara, the governor of Bamyan was Hazara, the governor of Daikundi was Hazara. So do you think there is a relationship between this unique Hazara historical experience and this kind of perspective to the society?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for this question. And as Anis echoed in her own remarks, that Hazara women have long been subjugated and subjected to discrimination and violence and persecution based on, you know, their ethnic identity, their religious identity, but also their gender identity as well. However, in the last 20 years of foreign forces intervention in Afghanistan, it enabled the Hazaras, particularly women, and breathing room to be able to pursue opportunities, particularly in education. And as a result, we had Hazaras, especially women and girls who excelled fully in areas of education and otherwise. Hazara youth in particular, women, both boys and girls, began to thrive fully, leaving no stone unturned by making the most of this once in a lifetime opportunity that they had. As you mentioned, as a relatively open-minded and liberal society, the number of girls attending schools in Hazara regions exceeded. He also mentioned that Dr. Sima Samar, who is a Hazara, became the first Minister of Women's Affairs and later the chairperson of the Afghanistan Human Rights Commission, Independent Human Rights Commission. You also mentioned that Dr. Habiba Saribi was the first female governor of Bamyan, who was also a Hazara from 2005 to 2013. But despite all these achievements and progress made by Hazaras, particularly Hazara women and girls, nonetheless, Hazaras have been and continue to be disproportionately targeted and attacked by being singled out for beheadings, for killings, suicide attacks, as well as kidnappings. If I can give a few examples briefly. So in 2015, for example, a terrorist group stopped passengers on buses in Zabul, who then identified Hazaras, selected them, and then separated them, and then summarily executed 9 Hazara passengers by slitting their throats, including 2 Hazara women and one Hazara young girl, Tabassum, who was 9 years old then. Another example was the Halo Trust in 2021 last year, which also illustrates the distinct nature of these attacks on Hazaras. Again, Hazaras were identified, were selected, were separated, and then killed. Actually, the CEO of Halo Trust, in his statement, James Cowan, mentioned that the attack was ethnically motivated and that the attackers were seeking Hazaras as their targets. In Kabul alone, in recent years, the Hazara populated area of Dashti Barchi has witnessed a bloodbath of young Hazaras, including girls, as we saw in school attack, on a school attack last year in May, as well as maternity hospitals, sporting centers, wedding halls, and other social gatherings. The 12th May attack on the maternity hospital in Kabul clearly illustrates the distinct violence and injustice experienced by and perpetrated upon Hazara women who were targeted and so brutally killed during the most vulnerable and fragile moments of their life when they were giving birth to their newborns. Hazara women in particular have been most affected by these decades-long violence and hostility, both with respect to their identity as a Hazara, but also their gender as a women, but are now facing harsh and new realities under the Taliban, with their most basic human rights wiped away by the new militant group. Hazara women's pain and suffering has been and continue to be distinct, as we saw in the attacks a few days ago on the boys' school in Dashti Barchi, where mothers were running hopelessly around, unable to find the remains of their young sons. They did not have any access to get to the hospitals to be able to find their children, nor were they able to donate any form of blood to those who were wounded. So throughout history, Hazara women, as we mentioned, have been used as slaves, but also deprived of basic rights, such as the very important right to education. And as a result, most Hazara mature women in Afghanistan are illiterate today because they were deprived of that basic right to education, based on their gender as a woman, but also their identity as a Hazara. The education of women, for instance, was considered futile in Afghanistan society, as it was believed that Hazara women were considered inferior and subordinate to other members of society. Since the return of the Taliban to power in Afghanistan, Hazara women have continuously and disproportionately been targeted, either detained, tortured, and at times killed and their bodies laid on the side of the streets. The Taliban have dismantled the constitutional order that provided some basic rights to the Hazaras and have established their Islamic emirate, which institutionalizes sectarian and ethnic discrimination and violence towards the Hazaras. The Hazara people have virtually lost all potential posts which they had in the government. As well as that, the Taliban have removed all Hazaras from positions of authority in institution and in other places of employment. Lastly, Hazara women have completely been silenced. If I can give the example of Alia Aziz, who was the head of the Herat Women's Prison, who disappeared in October of last year. Family and friends believe that she was detained by the Taliban because of her position as the head of the prison, but also her identity as a Hazara woman. She remains missing to this day. There's no information in terms of her whereabouts. Again, just earlier this year, Zainab Abdullahi, a young Hazara woman who's 25, was so-called mistakenly shot in the head by the Taliban. And this just illustrates the very nature and the very real threats the Hazara women particularly have faced throughout history, but now again under this brutal Taliban regime, both based on their identity as a Hazara, but also their gender as a Hazara women.
Thank you, Sitarah. It was very informative, and we can follow experimentally how the Hazara women are very experiencing very unique gender discrimination. And the last question, and maybe very short answer from Anis. Anis, do you think belonging to a diversity or experiencing unique gender discrimination, is it just a negative experience, or it's can be positive also? For example, if you not experience this kind of discrimination, how is it possible to see the society from inclusive perspective, from justice perspective? Isn't it good, for example, that we think that being the member of a minority is just not negative, it's a potential for justice, for social equality also?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, as you said, Hazaras, as a group, Hazaras are far more progressive and far more liberal and open-minded in comparison to other groups in Afghanistan, and that has been to the advantage of Hazara women, and that's why we have so many Hazara women role models within the government, as well as within the civil society, members of civil society that who have been playing significant roles in shaping a different environment for women from all ethnic and religious groups to advocate for their rights. That has been an advantage, but if you that has significantly advantaged Hazaras. But at the same time, if you put that within the broader system, again, the system of power that structures a society, again, although Hazara women have enjoyed progressive lives, they have lived, they have been leading kind of a liberal lives within Afghanistan, but at the same time, within the broader system, they have experienced systematic and institutional discrimination and oppression. So that is the distinct disadvantage. And I'm not saying that Hazara woman, as a member of Hazara community or Hazara ethnic group, has been constantly disadvantaged. There have been certain advantages for the Hazara woman, and given the number of Hazara women who are getting an education, Hazara women who are leading and initiating social movements within Afghanistan, advancing social changes in Afghanistan. But at the same time, within the broader system, they have been multiply disadvantaged, oppressed, and discriminated against. And that's why we need an intersectional approach to understand all these complexities.
Thank you, Sitarah, and thank you, Munira. Thank you very much, Anis. And today we talked about intersectionality in Afghanistan as a new work to understand the gender discrimination better from another perspective. So Anis talked about why the mainstream discourse is not working in Afghanistan and not help us to make the gender discrimination understandable. Sitarah talked very details about the historical background of Hazara women and about systematic discrimination against Hazara. And finally, Anis explained how intersectionality perspective help us to analyze the complexity of gender discrimination in Afghanistan and why we need to see the gender discrimination from this kind of perspective. Do you want to add more something, Anis and Sitarah?
I don't have anything else to add, and I just want to say that I hope this conversation can initiate many conversations on intersectionality And I hope this conversation, despite the certain shortcomings that it has, I hope it inspires Hazara students to undertake an intersectional approach to gender analysis when it comes to Afghanistan. And I would like to thank all the organizers for organizing this talk, and thank you to yourself as well.
Sitarah?
Thank you for this important conversation. I don't have anything else to add. Just wanted to echo Anis's comments in terms of the importance of us to continue conversations around the Hazara people in general, but also with the specific focus on Hazara women. As we've mentioned in today's talks, the many dimensional lenses that can be applied in order to really analyze the injustices, the discrimination, and the violence that Hazara women have suffered and continue to suffer to this day.
Thank you very much.